also do not perceive any human as inevitably one thing religiously throughout their entire life career. Okay, so my choice is to discuss Hassidus. This is also in response to people who've asked me, well, what do you teach at Vassar? And I'm currently teaching a course in Hassidus. People say, oh, could we audit? Is there any way of auditing? Well, there's no way of auditing, but I can distill what we do in 11 weeks, twice a week, into a series. I think it'll be about 3 series of 4 interconnected lectures in which I talk about Hassidus as a movement. I give some history, but the fact is that we all live with the Library of Alexandria in our pocket, right? And so names, dates, etc., are easily Googleable. What's less easy to get at, I find, is concepts, ideas, right? Thought structure. And that's often not discussed so much when one discusses Hassidus, or one discusses it in a watered down form, or one deracinates it, pulls it out of its context, right? I mean, if you think about, Hasidim appearing in the media, for instance, although he's been canceled, the famous Woody Allen scene in Annie Hall where all the goyim at the table look at Woody Allen as if he's a Jew. And what does a Jew mean? It means a male person with a long beard and payas and a black hat and all of that. So Hasidim are iconic, right? We also hear about them in the news. The New York Times, at least on this coast, has in the past several months published exposés of the Hasidic educational system and its failures and discontents. And more recently, just a couple of days ago, about Hasidic political power in New York politics. So we see Hasidim in that aspect, and also, of course, in Israeli politics, right? Although what's called the ultra-Orthodox range of Judaism is considerable, from people who are not Hasidic to people who are Hasidic, and people who are sort of walkers between the worlds, as we'll see. The fact is that when many people, whether in America, Europe, or Israel, think of observant Jews, they have the Hasidic image in mind. So it imprints on us in a considerable way. And the way it's often talked about is historically. We'll start with the Baal Shem Tov, and we'll go through, the movement. We'll talk about the first generation, about which little is known. Then the students of the Baal Shem Tov, about which more is known. And they're students in the 3rd generation of Hasidus, who are quite wild and diverse, and perhaps the best known, with very few writings remaining from the 1st generation, a little bit from the 2nd generation, but then an efflorescence, an explosion of literature in the 3rd generation. And people will talk about neo-Hasidus and the influence of Hasidus on subsequent Jewish movements, right? But that's one way of thinking about it historically. Another way is sort of an expose of Hasidic life, which in the past has essentially involved secular Jewish reporters going into Hasidic enclaves, by which we mean Chabad Hasidim, who tend to be, quote unquote, more open to the world, right? And discovering the secret lives of this strange sect, right? Which turned out to be not so secret and not so strange, right? And, that's another approach to it. More recently, there's been, actually documentary explorations of deeper, darker Hasidus, like Satmar or Breslov, or, groups that were less accessible than Chabad, historically, and we'll talk about why. And then most recently, of course, I bet many of you have seen Shtisel, which is about Haredim in general, but Hasidic family in particular, and unorthodox. And there's a whole explosion of literature about escaping from Hasidus and questions of the social polity and policies of Hasidim and their families, and abusive situations, really sort of sensationalist, right? I want to contextualize Hasidus as, and this might be strange to you, the first Jewish reform movement. The first Jewish reform movement. When we think about reform, we really think about German reform in the 19th century, sermons in German, rabbis wearing almost Christian liturgical garb, organs, pew-style, theater-style seating, right? The understanding of the Jewish ritual laws and halacha, Jewish legal corpus in general as secondary to moral concerns. The idea of being a Jew in the home and a German on the street, or the idea of not even articulating the word Jew and talking about Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. So that's how we think about classical German reform. But in this class, which begins with this four-part class dedicated in honor of Cliff and Sarah Cornell. Hi, Cliff, I see you. I'm not sure Sarah is there, but she may be. And in partnership with a long list at this point. I remember when Ari Katz was just like Ari Katz and a bunch of 10 friends who put in like $1,000 to start this whole thing, right? And now it's this amazing enterprise where you can come on and get educated by mediocre scholars like myself, right? You can contribute, you can become members, right? And in this 4-part series, I'll be thinking about Hassidus as really the first pre-German classical reform, Jewish reform movement, right? Or religious revival, right? There have been crisis points in Jewish history that have required enormous adjustments to the idea of what Jewishness was. Even before there was Jewishness, when there was Israelite religion, and there was a temple in Jerusalem, and worship consisted of sacrifice for the most part, right? And there were incipient houses of prayer, houses of gathering, batei kinesiot, in various places, some quite large, like in Alexandria in Egypt, right? When the temple was destroyed, it required a tremendous reconfiguration. I see the comments in the chat. You might want to hold them until the end, because I'm alone here. I'm not. There's nobody moderating the chat, so I'll try to address the comments at the end. But it's better if you put them in at the end. There was a tremendous disconnect when the temple was destroyed. People had the rabbis at a place called Yavne, a council in northern Israel, in the year 90 or so, about 20 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, had to rethink Judaism without its center, right? Without sacrifice, without a temple, without a land, in exile, how to create a portable, user-friendly corpus of information that could go with Jews throughout their peregrinations, throughout their wanderings through the world, which were now beginning. And that was rabbinic Judaism, and that was a great reform. But the second great reform in Judaism happened in the late 1600s, the early 1700s, and at a time when there was a great sociological abrasion within the Jewish community of Central and Eastern Europe, what is now Central and Eastern Europe. It was a time in which terrible pogroms had been waged against Jews in White Russia, now known as Ukraine, by Khmelnytsky, who was a great Ukrainian, right? But also a terrible anti-Semite. Terrible decimation of communities. Communities were still reeling after the advent of Shabtai Tzvi, who was a famous false messiah, who we'll be discussing when we discuss Messianism. And the feeling was in those communities that what it meant to be Jewish had somehow ossified into what people did in yeshiva, which is pull books off the shelf, open them up, and bury themselves in those books, right? What did it mean to be an average Jew and want desperately to be connected with something beyond yourself? After terrible devastation in the community with these two great tragedies, the Sabbatian movement, in which many people converted, or if they didn't convert and the Frankist movement subsequently, if they didn't convert, their lives were their hopes were shattered in a central principle of Judaism, the messianic principle, the principle that something would come, someone would come and transform the present reality into something, well, deeper, more profound, more continuous, more peaceful, right? And then the physical devastation of communities in the Chemiyaki pogroms, right? Jews were looking desperately to connect with, and I'm saying this with capital letters, right? Something bigger, right? With what they would have called God. But their way in, on average, as average people, cutters of wood and drawers of water, was stymied by the fact that they had a functional literacy, most of them, in very basic Jewish stuff, but in which the primary text, the Gemara, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud, right? Rabbinic midrash, rabbinic literature was not accessible to them because we're simple people. We need to make a living. We can't go. We can't afford to go and sit in yeshiva like the sons of the magnates in the community. And so there was a strong spiritual desire coupled with objected physical, historical circumstances that made people cry out for a new model and a new kind of leadership. At the beginning, Hassidus captured the imagination both of the common people, choppers of wood and drawers of water, and of the scholarly elites who looked at the Gemara and Nedarim and said, this is wonderful, this is great, we can figure out how to tithe salt if we need to, right? That's an expression, to tithe salt means to take 1/10. How do you take a tenth of, you have to count every grain of salt, right? We've gotten to that level, so to speak, but is that all there is, right? Is that all there is, right? That was the question. The choppers of wood and drawers of water asked, is this all there is? Laboring my whole life, right? And not feeling a connection that seems to be a connection to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism. But I do feel a connection when I'm out in the field chopping wood, right? Or I go down to the river to bring the water, right? I do feel a connection with, I don't know, it's like there's something greater than me, and that something is in everything, and it is in me as well. And what is that, right? A great desire to connect, both among elites who said, is this text all there is? And among simple people who said, is labor all there is? Or is there an experience that suffuses the entirety of nature and everything that can encompass me too? Hassidus became one of the most influential forces in Eastern and Central Europe throughout the 19th and early 20th century, to the extent that anyone who was not in the Hasidic movement was called a misnagid, an opponent, right? Can you imagine if there was a political party that was so dominant in America, so completely dominant? I'm not talking about 49 to 51, right? So completely dominant that everybody was called after that party, right? And everybody else was called the opposition, right? The opposition. So if you weren't a chassid, you didn't have an identity. You were misnogid. You were against something, right? That's not an identity. You know that. You realize that, right? Even though it seems like that on Twitter and in the blogosphere, right? Being against something is not an identity, right? Hasidism seemed to be for something significant, and everybody else, let them go. They do the same thing they've been doing for generations, right? Hasidism was the sexy new thing. We have to ask ourselves a question then. How did a movement that was the sexy new thing end up being the most ultra-Orthodox conservative movement, right? When we think about the right wing in Israel, we talk about the Haredim, but we mean also among them Hasidim, right? If Hasidism was so fresh and so, amazingly innovative, right? What happened? And the answer, sadly, is, well, mostly the Shoah, mostly the Holocaust, in which about 70% of Hasidim, who were village people, not urban people, with some notable exceptions, were murdered. And, Rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis, were very insistent that simcha, the joy, is a path to connecting with the divine. We'll actually get into this probably in the second series, where we talk about the state of katnus, that's interiority, right? That's enfolding into oneself, being small, and the state of gadlus, which is the state of being open. How both of those states are part of the avodah, of the task, the worship work, spiritual work of Hasidism, and one isn't better than the other. But the truth is, when the rabbis said, Ruach HaKodesh eino shuriya ela mitoich simcha, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, does not rest upon one except in a state of joy, right? Interiority, there's a place for it, there's a time for it. But when one is truly depressed, it's very hard to find spiritual connection. And so after the Shoah, said a great teacher of mine, we've all become like Kohanim, like priests, people who would serve God, who would desire to serve God, who are now made impure by Tumas HaMes, made impure by the impurity of the dead. Each and every one of us as Jews is touched with that. And therefore, like the priest who couldn't engage in the service if he was defiled by the impurity of death. And why? Because when you see death, most of us think, it's a downer, right? I mean, some of us are very expansive and you see death as the beginning of the next stage and all of that, but most of us would prefer not to die or to be around death. And so it takes us down, it takes us out of a place where we have enough bandwidth to be spiritual people. And Hassidus, having lost so many people, turned in on itself and became very insular and very dark and very much concerned with regulation of its population, even the regulation of simcha, of joy. Okay, now we have to be happy, right? So let's be happy, right? What are we going to do to be happy? Well, we'll have some vodkas, right? So we medicate ourselves. And now is the time to be happy. The Rebbe says to be happy, so we all have to be happy, right? That's a form of regulation. It's not spontaneous. A lot of the spontaneity was drained out of the movement. Also, as we'll discuss when we discuss leadership, the problem of leadership is a particularly thorny one. Because if you want to be a charismatic, spontaneous movement, that's okay. But what's going to guarantee charismatic spontaneity in the next generation of the movement? Nothing. And so when the movement becomes one in which leadership is passed down from father to son, and I emphasize from male to male, right? And it absolutely uncategorically denies the possibility of female leadership, or new forms of the transmission of leadership that are not dynastic, it also turns in on itself because, well, some of you are parents, right? You know that your mileage with children will vary. Not every child is interested in what their parent is interested in. Not every child is suited to leadership. And people who are unsuited to leadership, who have leadership thrust upon them, make particularly bad leaders. And so that's one of the reasons that Hasidism declined. You know, one of the modes of Hasidic interaction is through storytelling. We'll be telling stories throughout the series, but I just want to tell one now, kind of to whet your appetite. If you look around the ultra-Orthodox world today, you'll see that Hasidim and their so-called opponents are not any longer so much opponents. In fact, there's more dissent between and among various flavors of Hasidim. So Satmars, right, traditionally hate Lubavitchers, and Lubavitchers hate Satmars, for instance, right? Then there is between Hasidim and Misnagdim. There's less tension. And that has to do with exactly what I just described to you, a decline because of historical circumstances. The story someone told me a long time ago about a mishulach, an emissary, who was sent from the Holy Land to collect money. I don't know, some of you may be of an age where you remember when people, I don't know how it was in California, but in New York when I was growing up, people came to the door and knocked and collected tzedakah, right? And sometimes were given a meal, and right? So that's a mishulach, usually from the Holy Land, collecting money for poor brides or for a yeshiva. This guy was collecting money for a misnagdish yeshiva, right? For a yeshiva of the opponents of Hasidism. But it was quite obvious that he was a Hasid. He was in full drag, right? And Hasidim dress a certain way. There's much diversity among and between the different groups of Hasidim. But in general, they maintain a kind of dress that is reminiscent of, let's say, Polish 18th century nobility with certain tweaks and modifications. So this guy looks like a chassid, long untrimmed beard, black long coat, right? A bever, it's called, a low hat that's quite large around the sides, right? This isn't Shabbos, so he's not wearing a streimel, a furry hat, a low one, or a spodik, a furry hat, a tall one, right? He's wearing a gartel, a belt to separate his human half from his animal half, right? His shoes have buckles on them and not laces. His jacket is buttoned right over left, like a woman's jacket. Why? You know, because the side of chesed, the side of love, the right side of the divine array of the Sfirot must fold over, encompass, repress, suppress the other side, the side of strict judgment, right? So that's a visual manifestation of the idea of love conquers all, so to speak. He's dressed as a chassid, and yet he's collecting money for a misnagdish yeshiva. Voden, how can this be? So he says, I'll tell you why I'm doing this. But in order to do that, I have to tell you a story, right? So we have a story within a story, characteristic of Hasidic storytelling. He says, once upon a time, there was a family in which there were two daughters. And when the daughters got married, their husbands moved into the house, you know, as was the custom. And one daughter ate only milk products, and the other daughter ate only meat products. It sounds like my students, when you invite them over, they say, you know, yeah, I'd love to come, Professor Epstein, but I only eat fruits that have fallen from the tree on a Thursday afternoon, right? You know, that kind of thing, right? Very particular, right? One only eats milk products, one only eats meat products. And that was the story. one day, a Meshuach like me, says the Meshuach, comes to the house to collect money for yeshiva in Israel, like I'm coming to the house to collect money for yeshiva in Israel. Walk in, they offer him a meal. He says, oh, I'd love to come. And they say, well, which table do you want to sit at? The meat table, right? Or the milk table? Because there's meat dishes and milk dishes, they have to be kept separately. And he says, I'd be happy to sit at the milk table, right? And the food comes, and at both the daughter and the husband who eat meat and the daughter and the husband who eat milk, what's served on both tables is potatoes. And that's the point of the story. Said the Meshuach, right? When somebody's correcting me, shaliach, I think is trying to say, it's not shaliach, right? In the old terminology of Hassidus, it's Meshuach, the person who is sent, right? The word shaliach is a term that's used in Chabad Hassidus, something we'll talk about hopefully as we go along. That's the point of the story, that they're both eating potatoes. What do you mean? Well, in former days when there was meat to eat, the meat people would sit in one place and the milk people would sit in the other place. But now that we've fallen on hard times and all there is to eat is potatoes, we all eat them at the same table. We eat our bulbous at the same table, correct, right? And so it is with me, said the Meshuach, right? In the old days, a misnagid would collect for a misnagidish yeshiva, and a chosid would collect for a chassidish yeshiva. But now that after the Holocaust, we as a people have metaphorically only potatoes to eat, very little left. We help each other out. Right? So that's actually a positive slant in a way on the tragedy. But Hassidus declined. Hassidus now, because of demographics, because of number of children had, increases dramatically. And it will be a significant force in the 21st century, not only because Chabad Hasidism is taking over Jewish communities all over the world and rebranding them as its own thing, but because the other groups are growing exponentially also. Now you have to understand one important thing about Hassidus before I get to today's topic specifically. And that is, don't let the costume fool you. My father had a joke when we were growing up, which is when we were on the street and we passed somebody who was dressed in full Hasidic drag, my father would say, don't let the costume fool you. He's really Jewish. In other words, the way we dressed as Jews was like everybody else. For us, that was Jewish. My father would say, don't let the Hasidic costume fool you. He's really Jewish. So I'm saying to you, don't let the costume fool you. Hasidim are ultimately, and in a very serious way, postmodern. And by that, I don't mean that they're on cell phones or dumb phones. A lot of them don't use smartphones, right? Flip phones they'll use, right? Which is, a postmodern phenomenon. After all, you and I all remember when we walked down the street for the first time and heard somebody talking to themselves like a schizophrenic, right? And we realized it was somebody talking on a phone in their ear, it was, right? This is a very, very young phenomenon, as those of you who are my age and above certainly know. I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about things like having, like my cousins, 11 children in one case and 13 children in another case. That's a modern and particularly postmodern phenomenon. It's nekoma, or if Hitler Yamach Shemo, it's a revenge on Hitler, may his name be erased, having many children. And it's also not what Jews did historically. In Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages, Jews had an average of 2.5 children demographically. It's not out of desire. It's because there was infertility, as there is today. It's because people died, children died, right? So you might have had 10 pregnancies and ended up, unfortunately with 2.5 children. right? But that was a fact. Jewish families were not vast in the Middle Ages. In Europe in the 19th century, they got bigger because nutrition got better, because infant mortality, thank God, went down, and now they're much bigger again. But that's a good example of the ways in which Hasidim, who look so, quote unquote, medieval to some people, right, are in fact postmodern group. So I want to trace in this series how Hasidus developed from a small grassroots movement to a political, institutional, spiritual force in Orthodoxy, but in Judaism in general, right? And I'm particularly interested in how it was affected by and reacted to and collaborated and clashed with other movements of its time, including Misnagdism, the established yeshiva rabbinic culture, Enlightenment, Zionism, and its relationship, you're not going to believe this, to Greek Orthodox Christianity, its attitude toward Messianism, right? Its place in modernity, how it's influenced American, European, and Israeli, Jewish culture and spiritual movements, and it's a lot to do. So in this first, Ari calls it a master class. That was not my choice. I'm not the best. I'm not the master of anything, including my schedule or what pants I put on. Okay, so let's get that clear. I don't have all the answers. I don't even have some of the answers. But I'll do my best to answer your questions. Sometimes you'll have questions. I'll look in the chat at the end that will be addressed further on in the course, and I'll have to tell you that we'll do that. But what I want to do is set up some groundwork in these 4 sessions for our continuing understanding of Hasidus. So today I'll talk about Halacha and Kabbalah, that is Rabbinism and Kabbalism. Are they mutually exclusive systems or not, in the time remaining to us? And then next time I'll talk about the limits of diversity in Judaism in general, like who's a Jew and who isn't a Jew, and how far can you push the envelope, right? Both in terms of ethnicity, in which it's claimed there's no problem. Jews are not a race, etc., right? Except that it is a problem for some Jews, right? And how far can you push it theologically, right? Can you say, if you say God is a 3-headed cow, are you still Jewish? Right? If you say, I'm a believer in the Trinity or Jesus is God, right? Are you still Jewish? What if you say those things and do Jewish things, the most possible Jewish things, right? What if you say that your spiritual leader is buried in a cemetery in Queens and that he will be resurrected soon to judge the quick, the living, that is, and the dead, right? Is that Jewish, right? Is it Jewish if you also don't wear a garment of mixed wool and linen while you say that make that theological intention, right? Does that make your idea kosher? Are there kosher ideas and non-kosher ideas in Judaism? So that will be next week. And then the third week, we'll talk about leadership models, right? From the Bible, which begins with shamans, S-H-A-M-A-N-S, yes, you heard me correctly, like Abraham. And throughout the rabbinic and medieval period and up to our current situation in which we're led by rabbis, right? And some are led by rebbes, and what's the difference? And then we'll finally, in this section, conclude with the idea of messianism. What is messianism? Why is it mystical or non-mystical? That is messianism a pragmatic idea, or is it a mystical idea? Is it a political idea, or is it a spiritual idea? Who is the Messiah? What is this idea of messianism, and why is it highly problematic in Judaism, and what are the limits of it? Can you say that a currently living person is the Messiah? If you do so, what are the problems? Can you say that a dead person is the Messiah? Is that possible? Why or why not? What is the task of the Messiah? And how does Hasidus view the messianic idea, right? So I think that we have a lot of interesting stuff to chew on. But I just want to start with the first question, Rabbinism and Kabbalism. So I don't know how many of you are lawyers or know lawyers, but Ari Katz isn't around, so we can say whatever we want, like even Shakespeare, like kill all the lawyers, right? I have nothing against lawyers at all. In fact, I've used them once or twice in my life to good effect. But you don't have to answer this, but just think about the question of whether the lawyers you know are mystical, right? Whether the lawyers you know are mystical. It would seem that the profession of lawyering is a very kind of tachlis profession. And it would seem that the profession of being mystical or metaphysical is, by tachlis I mean down to earth, right? Very pragmatic. The profession of being mystical or spiritual is not pragmatic at all. It has to do with connections with the unseen, right? Lawyers are the show me people. Lawyers are the people who want the documentation. They want the evidence, right? And so when we think about Judaism and the way it developed, in its desire to create a society with parameters, with boundaries, with equity, with a sense of law and recompensation and fixes for when things go tragically wrong between individuals, and really as a life guide, right? A way of thinking about moving through the world from the moment that one wakes up in the morning to the moment one goes to sleep at night, from the moment one is born to the moment one dies, in relation to nature, in relation to people, in relation to money, in relation to work. Judaism is closely bounded by the idea of law. But the source for that law in the Mishnah, and then in the Talmud, increasingly kicks at the boundaries of what this culture is to be about. Because not in the Mishnah, which is apodictic, apodictic, the Mishnah is a law code, right? So it says things like, stop at the red light. And then it asks the question, what do you mean by stop? And what do you mean by red? And if it's not a light, but it's this thing that comes down that has a red, piece of cardboard, right? Do I still have to stop, right? That's what the Mishnah does. The Gemara incorporates the Mishnah and says, stop at the red light, and then asks all the Mishnah's questions, and then says, once Rabbi Gamliel was doing XYZ thing, and his sons came to him, and they said, we didn't stop at the light, and a cop stopped us, and we got in trouble, and now we have a court date, right? The Gemara becomes discursive, and it tells stories. And there's the rub. Because in the interstices, the little places between the legal matters discussed in the Gemara, there is a lot of agadic material, right? And that agadic or legendary material enlivens the law and puts the law in a context, whether it's a historical context, a narrative context, a moral context. And it's the Agada that fascinates me. I'm married to a rabbi, one of the first female Orthodox rabbis, actually. Certainly the first one from Hungary. So she's very interested in halacha and law. And I'm interested in Agada, because when I was in yeshiva, when we learned the law, we would learn the law. And then when we come to a certain place where there's a story about Rabban Gamliel, the Gemara Rebbe would say, this is all Agada, we're going to pass over this, and we continue on Daf Mem Amud Beis. Right? We're skipping over all this legendary stuff, these Babin mices, these stories. But of course, it's in the stories that the interesting stuff comes out. And we find that even in rabbinic literature, there's a concern with the unseen. There's a concern with the worlds that overlay our world and undergird our world. We're not supposed to worry about them, We're not supposed to be concerned with them. We're supposed to focus on halacha, on law, right? But there are other worlds in the Gemara. And there is both theosophical speculation, that is, thinking about the nature of God, about the nature of divinity. And there is magical praxis, that is, attempts to manipulate the situation of the universe to one's personal advantage by, if it could be said, manipulating God in some way. So you have both trying to know God and trying to manipulate God. These ideas are recorded also alongside the very practical laws in the Gemara. And they become an intrinsic part of Jewish consciousness through the Talmud and through rabbinic culture, and eventually by people for whom there was an interest in knowing divinity or in manipulating the forces of, divinity in a magical way. These things sort of separated out and became what we know as Kabbalah, the tradition, right? A tradition of metaphysics. The tradition of metaphysics of Kabbalah seems unbroachable. Let me move back. The gap between the tachlis, the pragmatic world of law, and the airy-fairy spiritual world of metaphysics of Kabbalah seems unbreachable, right? They seem like two different things. But the truth is that the hard-headed, down-to-earth pragmatists of the legal profession and the seemingly transcendent, metaphysical mystics and magicians were often the same people. Artzvi Verblovsky, great Israeli scholar, wrote a book on Yosef Karo, who is the arch-legist, the arch-lawyer. He is the compiler of the Shulchan Aruch, the great compendium of Jewish law. And that book was called Yosef Karo, Lawyer and Mystic. Because here's how Yosef Karo learned what he did about Jewish law from the often laconic, that is, very brief and not in particularly detailed detail, Mishnah. This is how he learned out the laws. Not only by reading the Mishnah and the Gemara and meditating on them and thinking about it, but at night, when it was quiet, the Mishnah, in the form of a woman or a man, it's unclear, came to him and spoke to him. And that was his magid. That was his magid just means teller, right? That was his spirit, the spiritual entity. So the law code itself, which often in rabbinic legend takes the form of a woman, which is why I said, maybe it was a female entity, because the Mishnah is referred to as she, right? Came and spoke to Yosef Karo, the hard-headed lawyer, about herself, revealed her innermost secrets to him. So people who were halachis, legal scholars, could also be mystics, right? So there's a very interesting tension between halacha and Kabbalah. And that tension is this. Halacha wants you to be law-abiding. And the aim of halacha, if it's done correctly, is to get to yes. Get to a way, v'chai bahem, and you shall live by means of these laws, in a very practical sense. And Kabbalah is about something else. It's not about determining what the Torah is and how we can live by it. It's about determining Ritzon Hashem, the will of God. And sometimes that pulls us in an anti-law direction. We can say, in other words, that the Torah says X, but I spoke to God, right? Or I spoke to the spirit of the Mishnah, or I'm channeling the angels, and they're telling me something else. that seems to be in contradiction. And what we will see throughout Hassidus is these two poles pulling at each other. Example, one must pray the morning prayer by a certain time. It changes every morning because the sun is in a different position. But if you pray the morning prayer after the time for the morning prayer, you haven't prayed the morning prayer, right? Definitionally, ontologically, the morning prayer is said in the morning. If you say the morning prayer when it's not the morning anymore, then it's not the morning prayer. That's halacha. Hasidim would say, I don't know. I just don't, it's not coming to me. I can't, I have to get in a place, a headspace, right? These are like your hippie friends, by the way, right? I have to get in a headspace where I can actually offer the morning prayer, because if I just offer the morning prayer as lip service, then it may be in the morning, but it's not prayer, right? If I want to pray, it has to be avodah shebelev, the service of the heart. So I'll pray after the time in the morning prayer if necessary. And that will be my morning prayer. So you see the tension between law and the other thing. What's the other thing? Well, God, you gave me this body. You gave me this mind, right? If I can't focus on this prayer now, it means that it's your will. And I know that your law, your halacha says I have to pray within a certain period of time, but I know that your will is tugging me in another direction. And so Hasidus often existed in that tension. Okay, I'm going to open up the chat now. I can't believe we're at 1:51. Let me just see a couple of things. Am I recording this? Yes. Some personal notes. The name of the movie. Which movie was I referring to? I referred to several things. Shtisel on Netflix. That might have been the one.
Annie Hall.
Excuse me?
Annie Hall.
Oh, Annie Hall. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. You can remute so I don't have to hear the dog barking. Yes, that's excellent. Annie Hall by Woody Allen. If you still watch Woody Allen. It's Gene's understanding that the family in Shtisel are Yeshivish, Litvish. Not exactly true. They are a combination. And in fact, even in my own family, there's a lot of interface and interaction. So you have sort of Hasidish Misnagdim and Misnagdish Hasidim. And I even in Jerusalem knew a guy who was totally a Litvish, Yeshivish guy. He was like a Rebbe. He had it was on Racheli Menu Street. I forget what the name of the group was. They had a name, like a Hasidic group. Next time we'll talk about how they got their names, right? And he had a tish, he had a Hasidic gathering every Friday night. They would sit in bleachers like Hasidim do, and he'd sit at the head of a gigantic table, and he acted like a Hasidic Rebbe, except he wasn't. They would bring him a Gemara, and he would immerse himself in the Gemara, which is totally like antithetical to a lot of what goes on in Hasidus. So, there's a lot of mixture going on. But yes, there are misnagdim in the Shtisel universe and Hasidim. Do Hasidim believe, Ronald, that there should be a Jewish state? Your mileage may vary. We'll discuss this probably in the second series. Okay, Ahuva is correcting my Hebrew or amplifying my Hebrew. I am not speaking correct Hebrew, Ahuva. I am speaking Hebrew in the way that it's spoken by Hasidim. So they refer to a shaliach, right, in Chabad, and a mishulach in other Hasidus. Yes, it's not correct Hebrew, but that is how they talk about it. So we'll talk more about Chabad. Bernard points out that the Vilna Gaon was also a mystic. It is said sometimes Maimonides is claimed for mysticism, particularly for Chabad. It says that Maimonides, the arch rationalist, converted to mysticism at the end of his life. This is bullshit. Just to put a fine point on it. How can you watch the recording of the lecture? You'll have to contact CSP. Yes, and Julie, it's true that the point is that the form is retained in the potato story. Even though it's no longer relevant, they're all eating potatoes. That is one point. That's one point of the story. The other point of the story is when all there is to eat is potatoes. We're still sitting at separate tables. I'm sorry, Julie. Yes, correct. I forgot to tell. The moral of the story. So the Hasidic guy who's collecting for the Misnagdish Yeshiva says, at the end, he says, since all we have is to eat is potatoes, shouldn't we be sitting at the same table together, right? Correct spelling of Yosef Karo is in Hebrew, but you can translate it K-A-R-O, like Karo syrup, or you can translate it Q-A-R-O, or in any number of ways. But try K-A-R-O, that's the more familiar. Okay, so next time, we're going to move on to a discussion of sectarianism and denominationalism. I remember when I was in Yeshaya Gafni's course at Hebrew University, he very cleverly named his course Sex and Parties in the Second Temple Period. So all of us post-adolescent, the junior abroad kids thought, this is going to be a very interesting course. Of course, it was religious sects, S-E-C-T-S, and political parties in the Second Temple period, which is fine. But the question is this, it's often been noted that Jews are very fragmented, right? The truth is they're no more fragmented than any of the Western monotheisms, right? There are hundreds of sects and parties in the Christianity spectrum, right? It's not just Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox, but many, many subgroups. And in Islam, too, there are at least as many subgroups. It is endemic to religions to splinter into smaller and smaller groups. And we're going to have to ask ourselves what it means to be diverse and what the limits are in diversity. Because once Hassidus begins to brand itself as the address for spirituality within Judaism, it means that the other Judaisms, so to speak, have to reinvent themselves. And Hassidus has to find a way of keeping itself fresh and keeping itself unique. And what we see in the diversity, as we'll discuss next time, of dress and ideology and custom, within Hassidus is a tremendous, tremendous diversity as well, right? So there's Hasidism as part of a spectrum of Judaism that runs the gamut geographically and ethnically and chronologically. And then within Hasidism, a fascinating internal diversity. I used to get every year a contras, a pamphlet. It wasn't really a pamphlet. It could be a book this thick of Hilchos Pesach, the laws of Passover, before Passover. And it told you things like how to and not to kosher your kitchen and all these things. And then there was a section that I always found fascinating about Passover minhagim, Passover customs and avoidances. So some of you know that Ashkenazim and Sephardim broadly have different approaches to what can be eaten on Passover, what is considered chametz, that is leavened food, which is forbidden. One is considered kitniot, which is legumes, which are forbidden by Ashkenazic Jews and permitted by Sephardic Jews. But did you know that among Hasidim, there is a group that doesn't eat carrots on Passover, right? So there's a section about basically about Hasidic variations in Passover custom, which as a snapshot of the extreme diversity was very interesting. But I put it to you that diversity can make good neighbors into somewhat bad enemies. And it is to the question of diversity and its discontents that we will turn next time. So thank you for attending. It's really been a pleasure. Jack, thank you. That's very kind. I probably will need 10 plus sessions, but you have to tell Ari if you think it's good. So we're just experimenting with these 4, and it may be of the 110, 5 of you left, sorry, of the 110 people who are currently watching, some of you might say, oh, I wanted to know, I wanted you to start from the Baal Shem Tov and talk about the dates and the places, and you're not doing that, so this isn't my kind of course. But I just beg you to stick around and see what happens, because I think you'll learn more about Hasidism as opposed to about the history of Hasidism, because I'm a cultural and religious historian and not a historical historian, than you might otherwise. So I really, really hope so. And thank you for your kind, sweet words, which I will take with me as I go to cook dinner for my family. See you next week.
Again, Mark.
I look forward to seeing you. Take care. And this has been recorded. See you.